Welcome, everyone. Here today we are going to talk about dopamine, what it is, what it isn't, what it's related to clinically, and essentially everything that we can do to augment dopamine and how it relates to everyday life, but also to navigate misconceptions around what this neurochemical does.
Is stress correlated to a lack of dopamine?
So good question, interesting question. I think it really relates to what stress someone's talking about when they consider this question. I mean, there's a huge involvement with motivation and getting things done with kind of what's called eustress or positive stress. So when you have a stressful scenario like, you've got a paper to write or there's a test due that you have to study for, that kind of stress can really drive the motivation to pursue, the knowledge that's going to help you, attain a good grade on a test or a good paper that you're going to write. So in that sense, no, it's actually associated with a task and a goal. So dopamine is going to be higher in that setting. Now on the flip side, when someone's in a high level of distress, which is associated with chronic cortisol elevations, chronic sympathetic nervous system activity, that's going to relate itself to either exhaustion from a neurochemical perspective, which might impact sleep. So I think the milieu around the distress is going to affect dopamine in different manners that can ultimately make you unmotivated to continue doing something. And that state of unmotivation or lacking motivation really is going to be associated with lower dopamine in general.
Is detoxing from dopamine a good way to reset my dopamine tolerance?
So I've seen this dopamine fasting phenomenon kind of circle around in different places, but essentially a better question to ask, and I think what most people are trying to get across is the systemic reduction of extrinsically derived motivation and reward a good idea? All right, so when you think about all the ways in society that we get kind of validation and feedback that we're on the right track and that we're motivated to do kind of what we think we want to do, either from scrolling on Instagram or getting feedback from employers or whatever that might be, all those things give dopamine from the external perspective that mediate kind of consummatory reward in a sense. Like it's somewhat incentive, but really what the goal of a dopamine fast would be is to focus on intrinsic reward, which is going to be mediated by pursuing things of value to the survival of that organism. So for example, you can't fast from dopamine in the most fundamental sense because anything that motivates you to do anything in terms of needing to go urinate or going to go to the bathroom or to eat food or to go to sleep, those are all mediated by dopamine, right? If you don't have any of those positive forces moving you from one state to another, then you're basically going to just lay in bed all day but not even sleep, because that's also a focused dopaminergic function. In terms of resetting dopaminergic tolerance and also the enzymes and different neurochemistry and machinery behind making dopamine and allowing different phasic and tonic responses, taking breaks from highly stimulatory things like Instagram or Facebook or video games or pornography or sex or all these kinds of things that just add a little bit to life can definitely help restore some tone to the synthesis and release of dopamine. But again, it's really hard to segregate the dopamine that you're going to get intrinsically and the dopamine that you're going to get extrinsically, because you're going to go back into those scenarios, or generally speaking, you're not going to devoid yourself of the situations that lead to the dopamine in the first place. But it's an interesting topic, and I think the more data that we get from people trying these different fasts and then exploring their anecdotes and seeing if there's any validity to the behavior in general, it's a good question. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because it kind of sounds like a silly idea. But that being said, we just don't know.
Will poor quality sleep or lack of sleep affect my dopamine tolerance?
So I'm assuming by dopamine tolerance that the question is really asking, is poor sleep going to affect my ability to kind of generate motivation and kind of movement through the world? In the sense of, it's very clear in the literature that poor sleep is going to impact all executive function as far as working memory and the ability to really generate positive movement through the world and navigation. So, with the prefrontal cortex being kind of the seat of human executive function and the association with poor sleep on that, combined with the way that psychostimulants like Adderall, dopamine, and modafinil really help prefrontal cortical activity with increasing dopamine, the correlation is pretty strong there, even though I don't know of a direct poor sleep equals low dopamine across the board.
What kind of supplements can help my dopamine health?
So dopamine is a monoamine that gets synthesized from amino acids phenylalanine and tyrosine. So there's supplements that you can take, either just essentially amino acids or L-tyrosine in particular, that can help increase the amount of dopamine that you can make endogenously. Then there are adaptogens like bromantane and some different substances like that it can increase the enzymes that make dopamine from those amino acids, like tyrosine hydroxylase and the aromatic amino acid decarboxylases. So anything that really augments the ability for the areas of the brain, like the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, to make dopamine intrinsically can be really helpful. Some areas that I see this actually be detrimental from a supplementation perspective is using L-Dopa or velvet bean extract to increase motivation and dopaminergic function. But what I've seen that do in practice actually is start to inhibit the ability to make dopamine intrinsically. And I say that because when people go through a withdrawal of not taking macunapurines or that velvet bean extract for a period of time after taking it chronically, they get a withdrawal that I see typically the same with Adderall or Ritalin. So it's something I really encourage people to look out for as far as using things chronically that increase dopamine, because you can get that negative feedback loop that actually augments the reduction in intrinsic production.
How can I increase my dopamine in a healthy, natural way?
So contextually speaking, to increase your dopamine, we have to kind of divide that, right? So you don't want intensive phasic bursts of dopamine all the time, right? The goal of development is to actually automatize your predictions and get your life kind of set in a predicted way. In order to get pursuit euphoria and that feeling that you're still doing something positive and meaningful, you need to bring in novelty to whatever you're doing on a daily basis. So whether that kind of changes up your route to work, whether it's going to a different place to hike or going at a different time, doing a night swim, doing something different in the spectrum of here's what I normally do within my routine, I'm going to change it up again just to interject some uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, you actually get a little bit of novelty. And by doing something exploratory, you can actually generate, more knowns out of more unknowns. And that actually gets you more of that intrinsic burst of dopamine because you're something different. There's a novelty associated with it. You're messing with your predictions already, and that can generate, again, more dopamine. When it comes to other ways to increase dopamine, there's ice baths. There's, again, we talked about supplementation, doing hard things or doing difficult things. Again, because it's a goal-based process, you're going to get more dopamine that leads you to think that you're doing something, right and meaningful. So to sum it up, novelty is the biggest driver of dopamine. Movement towards getting needs met is another driver of dopaminergic production. And again, just changing up different ways and modes of doing your normal activities will help also get some little bursts of dopamine that will help you feel like you're still doing new and novel things.
How do I know if I'm dopamine deficient?
So on the lowest end of the spectrum, what that looks like is anhedonia. And what that term really encompasses is a depressive state that's not categorized by hopelessness, but actually just by no motivation. So these are kinds of cases where you see someone who's either completely normal from a phenotypic perspective, but they might complain of, I just don't feel like I want to do the things that I used to enjoy. I don't, I think that I still enjoy them, but I just can't muster up the energy to go and do it. So whenever someone is depressed in that sense, they come with those conditions of, I just don't want to do anything. And that depression has to be separated from different depressions that come with hopelessness or sadness or from grief, because that kind of dictates what pharmacologically we can do and what supplementally we can do to augment their dopaminergic responses. Clinically, when we give people stimulants or modafinil or L-Dopa or anything else like that, and they respond to it positively, or if they take a kind of stimulant-based antidepressant like bupropion or Wellbutrin, and they respond positively to that over something like an SSRI, Prozac, or sertraline, then we can also kind of diagnostically say that they're suffering from more of a dopamine-mediated depression than a serotonin-mediated depression.
I have ADHD and can easily get addicted to substances, food, or activities. Does this mean that I have a dopamine dysfunction?
Kind of. You could say it that way. The issue with ADHD in terms of sensitivity to the phasic spike. So the dopaminergic system is run by different kinds of receptors. And there's one class that are the stimulation derived receptors like the D1 and D5, and then there's the inhibitory receptors, the D2, 3, and 4. So when you have in ADHD, there's a hypothesis that there's just this general low tonic level of dopamine, so the pool of dopamine is just kind of low. And so when you do something that's really activating or really stimulatory, like cocaine or video games or other potentially addictive things, you get this big spike, and that to the brain is a massive reward. And so that reward gets marked as, hey, remember this event, remember the circumstances around it, remember the context. And so whenever you get into that context, it's like an easy button to activate that pathway again, and you fall into the behaviors and patterns that led to that decision in the first place. So, really with those kinds of individuals, what you have to do is just find where those places are and interject where they would like to be and how they want life to function, so they can focus on at least having a target to aim towards that is more substantially motivating than succumbing to those easy button pathways. Another issue that individuals with ADHD tend to have is the inability to follow through and finish projects. So the issue with reward proximity in certain long-term projects is a real issue, because you might start off with a really strong motivation to pursue something, but like a college degree or something takes 4 years, and that flame will start to fade out, and they lack the motivational resources to continue because they have that pool that's already lower, and they need more novelty and more success and more fluidity in that progress that someone else that could have more conscientiousness or that doesn't have that dopamine deficiency would otherwise not have to deal with. So supporting individuals like that with some kind of pharmacology or some kind of supplementation to keep them going, to generate a cortically driven, reward distant planning behavior is really important for their long-term success.
I only feel dopamine doing 1 or 2 activities. Outside of those, I feel terrible. Am I dopamine resistant?
So feeling dopamine is a phenomenon I think we need to actually parse out. When someone says they feel dopamine, so let's just use cocaine as an example because it's super easy. When someone does cocaine, you get this massive surgence of dopamine and norepinephrine and a bunch of other things, but when it boils down to it, it's not that event that's actually the reward. It just makes you feel euphorically pursuing everything. So everything becomes meaningful all at once, and you feel like you're on the right track to whatever you're actually doing at that time. So when you feel that kind of euphoria, that's actually not the end state. That's the trajectory to an end. And when you don't have an end that's actually going towards, you kind of feel lost when it's over. In the same sense, if you have behaviors or activities that give you that feeling, then you really need to lean into those and just say, these are what give me the most meaning. I feel the most alive when I'm pursuing these things, and just run with it. I mean, that's really about knowing yourself and knowing how to make your being the best possible. So, one shouldn't feel bad necessarily for only having a few interests that really make them feel alive. I think the inverse is actually untrue, in the sense that you need to have a multiplicity of things that you're interested in, because that kind of just pulls you away from hyper specializing in an area of focus that you feel most motivated in. And also to say that even within that field of interest, you can divulge into many different things after that. After mastery is attained in one thing, seeking out novelty within that domain is another step to expand your influence.